let's stop the blame game. We marry what's familiar, even if it's our worst nightmare. So let's not just focus on them being a jerk. Let's understand that the original trauma we had in childhood sets up who you're going to choose to be in relationship with. And if your family was screwed up, you're going to get involved with somebody who's screwed up. Now, if I can help you learn to become more like an adult, and you begin to be able to spot somebody that would replicate your family of origin and not date them, you have hope.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations with first-hand insights from the people on the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm David Condos, and today's guest is Meadows Senior Fellow Pia Mellody, who sits down with me for an exclusive two-part conversation. In this episode, she walks us through her early days with the Meadows program and how that experience led her to develop the renowned Meadows Model. So let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
Hello, I'm Pia Mellody, and I'm a senior fellow at the Meadows. I've worked there off and on for about 40 years, and I'm still doing it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being with us today, Pia. We're here at the Rio Retreat Center on the Meadows campus in Wickenburg, Arizona. It's so good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so let's start with kind of introducing you as a person, your story, how you got involved with this world of recovery.
Well, I had a lot of, in my family of origin, there were many alcoholic drug addicts in the three generations I was involved with. And several of them died, and they never got any help, and nobody would acknowledge that was going on. And what happened to me is that my younger brother got me involved in, what he did was he confronted me that I was drinking inappropriately. And I said, that's your disease of alcoholism talking to me. I don't drink. I'm not drinking like that. And he says, yes, you are. Only alcoholics hide their beer in the cookie jar. And I said, well, I hide it in the cookie jar so my husband doesn't argue with me about drinking. And he looked at me and said, you need to go to AA and you need to get sober. And that started the whole thing. And I said, okay, because I love you dearly and I believe you're telling me the truth. I will stop. And I did. And then a physician who I knew very well had been asked to start the Meadows as a physician, and I was a nurse, and he came to me. We were very good friends. We had already done work together at an indigent treatment center where we volunteered to treat indigents that were in a treatment center that had started by a woman in Wickenburg for indigent men. So we had already worked together, and he said, I was hired to start working for the Meadows, and I want you to come up and set it all up with me.
Yeah, and what was his name?
Paul Cleaver.
Yeah.
He was the original medical director of the Meadows. So he wanted me to go in there with him, and I was sober and all this other thing, and I had it in my family and all that, and I really wanted to do it. Because I really was glad somebody was starting a treatment center that was serious about recognizing alcoholism and treating it as though it was a disease and not something evil, and people did it because they were stupid, and ignorant.
Yeah, looking at it as a disease instead of a moral failing.
Yes, and I said, man, that sounds wonderful. I can't wait to do that with you. And so he said, okay, I've hired you. Now I want you to do all this setup. You have to do all this stuff to set up the department, and that's how I got going. And I loved it.
Yeah. And seeing,
I even had to buy the examining table down in Phoenix.
Oh, wow. So there was nitty gritty. You had a lot of roles. Yeah. But I imagine that having what you went through with your family and seeing how alcohol affected not only yourself but your family, I imagine that was a big motivating factor.
Oh, absolutely. Because all the time I was growing up, I remember saying to myself, why doesn't anybody help these people? Nobody's helping them, and it's a terrible disease, and they're sick, and everybody's ignoring it. I just didn't understand it. So when Paul asked me to start working with him, I already knew him very well, start with that other thing. Anyway, so I was just thrilled. and I'm still working there.
Yeah, apparently it worked out. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the best thing I ever did.
Yeah. So let's look at kind of that period of time in Wickenburg. So this is like the 70s, and we're out here in Arizona. I've heard that this is kind of like has a dude ranch history. Tell us about like what was it like here back then?
In Wickenburg?
Yeah.
At that time, it was much smaller than it is now. It was only probably about 3,000 people. And most of them were living up here because they didn't want to live in the cities. And it was a real small town, and everybody knew everybody and knew everybody's business and all that sort of thing. And I had a home on about 10 acres right on the river, and had every animal you can imagine to keep my kids busy so they wouldn't become drug addicts, actually. So I was already just ready to do something like that. I was thrilled, just thrilled.
Yeah, and I know like the Meadows physical building also has some history with that. What can you tell us about that?
Yes. I believe it used to be called the Slash Bar K. It was one of the original dude ranches there. There wound up being probably about 6 dude ranches all around Wickenburg because it was so beautiful, and this was one of them. And I would imagine it closed when it was about 30 years old. That's what it looked like. So it was it got run down. And so not only did Paul and I have to go around setting up a whole department and places for patients to be and make it more into not a hospital, but someplace that was serious, the management had to completely redo the whole building, the whole grounds, and everything else. So right in the middle of them doing all that, we were setting up this medical and nursing department. So we were all working together.
Yeah. And you mentioned like not wanting it to feel too much like a hospital, wanting it to have that real human element. Like how did you go about that, and kind of what did that look like? Well,
the first thing we did was there were rooms in a certain place off of a beautiful place where there was a fireplace and all that. There were rooms already. So what we did was we refurbished them and made them more like not like a hospital, more like a bedroom, and stuff like that. And then we had to set up a examining room, and then I had to set up a nursing room and place for drugs, all kinds of things. So what we did was Paul and I created that so it didn't look like a hospital, but it had everything we needed that would be in a hospital. So it was like being in a nice hotel, actually. It was lovely. And when people came, they were just gobsmacked about how beautiful it was. And so instead of being all miserable about being in a hospital treated and all that, they loved it there. They loved it there. And they were happy to be there.
Yeah, and I imagine that's a big part of it.
I think that's why the original, the people that bought it and started setting that up were a bunch of businessmen from Wisconsin. And I think mainly Wisconsin, and they wanted to set it up for men who needed to, who were really actually high-powered men and would come to that place and feel comfortable and blah, blah, blah. They set it up that way. Again, it changed after a while, but it still has that effect. Right. People love being there. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and I've heard stories of kind of cows wandering in and kind of like helping break some of that sterile hospital feel that you're trying to avoid.
Yeah, I happened to be, I would go in all hours and just had to do it because I was running a thing. And I went in there and this little old lady who was pretty physically ill came up to me and said, Pia, there's a monster outside my window. This was where the area that we detoxified people, and it was really a beautiful area. I said, okay, I don't think there is. Come on, I'll go look. So I opened the window thing, and I looked, and there was a cow outside the window who had gotten over the cattle guards and were eating the grass behind the treatment center. Yeah. And I says, honey, that's a cow. That's not a monster. It was just funny. We had a big chuckle, but that's the way it was because we weren't in a hospital. And all kinds of animals were going around there, and the people loved it. They just loved it. Yeah. It was not a hospital. It was critically set up as a hospital would be, except the place was lovely and the rooms are lovely, and it was laid back.
Yeah. And so I know you've described this a little bit, how the focus was kind of on alcoholic men at the beginning.
Originally, it was only men and only alcoholics.
How do you describe kind of what the approach was originally, and then kind of how it evolved to spread out and capture more things?
Well, while we were, it took a lot to really just standing flat on your feet and going, We set it up so it would be safe for people to come and stay there, and it was all organized, kitchen, dining room, all this other stuff. But it looked like a dude ranch, so it was very comfortable. But when they decided to also take women into, because it started to change a little bit, I think it changed owners right around then, and they wanted to have women there, which obviously created a lot of problems, because now we had to do a lot of, it was my responsibility. We had to do a lot of watching to make sure that people behaved. And there were many funny stories through that. I mean, it was just amazing how people behaved, but I enjoyed it. It was just all part of being around a bunch of human beings that need help, and they had to behave, and I was right in the center of making sure they did, because I had the staff that watched it 24/7, and there were various people that actually walked the property to make sure nobody was doing anything. So anyway, so I think it was about 3 years we started having women come, and that changed the whole thing around. But it kind of sweetened the whole process, you know what I mean? And it was more like life. Men don't live life all by themselves with other men. Well, some of them do, but I mean, they're children. There's women. There's all kinds of people.
Yeah, it reflected the outside world.
Absolutely did. But what it did for me is it meant that I had to work a lot harder, because I had the staff that had to be watching all that. You know what I mean? And I had to train them, but I loved it. I was so happy that alcoholic men and women, and then drug addicts too, because a lot of the alcoholics were taking drugs, so we had to do all that. Anyway, I was so happy these people were getting treatment in a lovely place and treated by people who were very respectful of them. We didn't look at them like there's something wrong with you. We looked at them that, hey, you have an illness, and we're going to treat it, and you're going to have to do a lot of work to get over this. So anyway. There's a lot of funny things that happened, more than just that cow, but a lot of them I can't talk about.
I understand. Yeah. And so kind of as you were getting into this work, working with the patients at the Meadows, how did you start to see other elements crop up, like codependence, trauma, family system stuff? And so describe kind of how you started to see that come up, and so you realized that it wasn't just the addiction, the disease of addiction, that was part of it, but that these other things were a big piece as well.
Well, there wasn't, actually the first word they used wasn't codependence. The first word they used to describe this was co-alcoholic. And what that word meant to be, it was the family member of someone who was alcoholic. And then later on, we changed the word from just alcoholism because we were treating so much drug addiction. Then we changed it to codependent. And that's a family member of somebody who's been living with an alcoholic or a drug addict or something like that.
Or because it's kind of based off the idea of chemical dependency.
Let me tell you a funny story too. Yeah. There was this guy, I can't tell you where he was, but he was a farmer from way up north, and he was an old curmudgeon. And I was interviewing him and doing all kinds of things. And I said, okay, now what do you drink? What is it you're drinking? And he said, I drink peppermint schnapps. Oh, how much are you drinking? Well, 2 pints a day. And I thought, how could you drink that much of that? Did that burn the heck out of your stomach? Anyway, it was really funny. He laughed. He said, no, I love it. I said, okay, you're going to have to invite family members to come to Family Week. He said, no, Pia, you don't want my family here. And I said, I looked at him and I said, that's your disease talking. And he said, no, Pia, I'm telling you the truth. And I said, look, let's not argue, but you need to invite them. And he said, okay, I'll invite them, but you'll regret it. You will regret it, because you have some responsibility about how people behave around here. and you're going to be sorry. And I said, well, I still think that's your disease talking. So anyway, eventually his family came, and they were absolutely god-awful. They caused more trouble on that campus, and he looked healthy compared to them. And I went up to him finally. I said, let me shake your hand. You were totally right, and I was totally wrong. And he smiled at me. He said, I told you so. And I said, you're right, and I was wrong.
Yeah.
Many funny things happen. But anyway.
But that shows how the family system plays into the whole
yes.
puzzle.
We started, the minute we started having more and more family come, that's when it got very complicated. My job got very complicated because my staff was the one that was really there 24/7, and I was not only taking care of the nursing staff and all that, I was taking care of the guys who trudged the property, the drivers. I had a whole bunch of people I was responsible for, and so when we started getting family members, it really got complicated for me, but I loved it. I was so happy people were getting help. I loved every minute of it.
Yeah.
So
then looking at kind of this experience that you had, in this period of time, kind of early stages of the Meadows, working with these patients and starting to see the trauma, the codependence, all these elements crop up. How did that come to inspire what became the Meadows model?
What I was doing was I was doing a lot of interviewing of the patients and talking to them, and I started to do on my own trauma work with them. Nobody was doing that. And so see, what happened was I was a recovering alcoholic, and I had a lot of trauma in my family. And over the time period of talking to the patients so much, all of them had been traumatized as children.
And so you were seeing that was a great need. I was seeing
that, and I was relating to all that. Yeah. And so I started to do a lot of work on figuring out what that all was about. That they were not only alcoholic, but they also were what they call codependent. In other words, they had some issues going on that had to be treated, I thought, in order to stay sober, and that the underlying trauma issues was what was getting in the way of a lot of them staying sober. They could get sober, but they couldn't stay sober. That was one of the problems. And I realized in just swimming in all that day after day after day that I got a good eyeball on all the trauma they had because they'd talk about it. And they wanted to talk about that more than anything else at all. And they'd start sobbing. And but they would feel a lot better after just talking to me about it. I was doing it as the nursing director, just because I thought I should examine that because it seemed to be part of the whole thing. Anyway, we started to talk to people who were family members were codependents, but really, you know what I discovered? Codependence is part of the human condition. You know what I mean?
So it's not necessarily something to be eliminated. It's just
it has to be dealt with. Okay. It has to be dealt with. At first, I thought it was people were kind of wackadoodle just from living with an alcoholic, And the alcoholics were telling me, "No, I'm the one that created that. They were crazy in the first place, and I married them." I said, "Now, let's stop the blame game." What I think happened was you married this person because she was similar or he was similar to your father or mother. We marry what's familiar, even if it's our worst nightmare. So let's not just focus on them being a jerk. Let's understand that the original trauma we had in childhood sets up who you're going to choose to be in relationship with. If your father was difficult, you're going to marry a difficult man just like he was. No, Pia. And I said, describe your father to me. And they did. And I said, who you're married to is just like that. And I had gotten the information. I said, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You married your father. You married your mother. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's how the family of origin.
Not only running the department and all that, I was deep in trying to figure out what in the heck was this underlying thing, codependence or co-alcoholism, that seemed to be worse than the addictions itself. So I interviewed and talked to and started trying to treat the people for that because nobody else was doing it. And I had the time because I was running the department, but they were in there all the time and they were talking to me, and I interviewed them a lot and eventually figured it out. And that's how the whole thing got started there. And so it was first co-alcoholic and then codependent to describe the family members. And then, after all these years of figuring out it's the nature of man to behave like a codependent, the submission, it's not really a good word. It's really about being human and having enough relational trauma that you're kind of screwed up.
Yeah.
And you wind up marrying or being relational with people that replicate your family. So you wind up replicating your childhood nightmare by marrying somebody who's going to help you recreate your family of origin. And she'll blame you, and you'll blame her, or he will blame you, and you'll blame him, or however your family thing is. Everybody blames everybody else, but the fact is, we tend to get relational with people that reflect who we grew up with. And if your family was screwed up, you're going to get involved with somebody who's screwed up. And then you'll be really reactive and blame them and feel horrible and divorce them and do the same thing again until you have 4 or 5 partners. And then it'll dawn on you that it's not about the other person, it's about you and who you're picking. Now, if I can help you learn to become more like an adult, and you begin to be able to spot somebody that would replicate your family of origin and not date them, you have hope.
And so it's part of
Isn't that funny?
It's part of the human experience in that we're all drawn to that, but it looks different for every person. And if we don't address it, if you don't deal with it, then it's going to create this cycle.
Yes, I remember this one guy that had spent a lot of time with. I said, I know you married your mother. You can't do anything else. Let me. I know your mother because you've told me about her. Let me describe your wife. And I said blah 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 blah. Right? And the guy was like, I did marry my mother. I said, that's where you're miserable. No, we're not going to blame her because you picked her and she picked you. Do you act like her father? Well, yeah, kind of. He reminds me of me. I said, that's the human condition. It's ironic and it's funny. It's black humor.
Yeah.
That's when I figured that out, and then I was also doing an inventory on who I married and realized all that. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. But then I thought, nope, there's some way to figure this out and change the internal dynamics of people so that they would recognize somebody who's familiar, that it wouldn't work, and start choosing people that are healthier. And I spent my lifetime on that.
Yeah.
So people would have less trauma in their life. There's nothing worse than marrying your mother if she was terrible, or marrying your father if he was terrible. Then you're really going to fight, be miserable, blame them, and divorce.
Yeah.
Or make your children totally miserable.
And perpetuate the cycle of trauma.
Perpetuate the whole thing. So I figured that out because I was swimming in it every day. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I wasn't like a therapist working in a building and saw maybe 5 people a day. I was swimming with 60 people every day, watching the whole thing repeat. And it helped me figure out a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. And so you just discovered it because you saw it all around you.
Yeah. And as I interviewed them more and more about all this, everyone said the same thing. And I said, and I remember one guy said to me, do you think we have to divorce? And I said, no. I'm working on a project about how to be a mature person and more relational. And if you get involved in some of this, so you learn how to be a real adult person and recognize when somebody's off the wall, but how to stay with them even though they're off the wall, how to stay relational in the face of that and walk yourself through it, you really will do a whole lot better. So I spent my life figuring all that out. So
yeah, and we'll dive into that further in the next part of this conversation, but that was great. Thank you so much, Pia.
Thank you.
Pia Mellody is the Senior Clinical Advisor for Meadows Behavioral Healthcare based in Wickenburg, Arizona. You can find out more about Pia and the rest of the Meadows Senior Fellows at meadowsbh.com. To check out more episodes of this podcast and find all kinds of other resources and tools from Meadows Behavioral Healthcare, visit beyondtheorypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.